Welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. My name is Christian Page. I'm your host. Grateful that you decided to join us. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're choosing to be here with us. Today, we have a great conversation with my friend, Zach Hightower. Zach works primarily in special ed at SOTA. He came to education through the pathway of being a para and is a phenomenal leader here in SOTA's community. We talked to Zach about strategies, about push in versus pull out, and about the importance of diversity and equity in the classroom. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Zach.
Our school, we really believe in relationships, and that is emphasized through mentor group. And so I wholeheartely believe in that.
What do they need? I have to be able to answer that question. And that takes a little bit of time. The biggest teacher, I think, is failure. The brain works in failure. And those failures are actually synapses rewiring themselves in your brain.
And think about where you want to be. Because when you find your place, you find your people. And our purpose is attached to people.
You know, when there's a phenomenal teacher, when there's a phenomenal educator, when there's a phenomenal mentor, one of the mistakes that we make is we make it look too easy. Like, everyone sees the shining moment on stage. No one sees, right, like the hard time spent. All right, welcome to The Essential Element, the Elements of Education podcast. I'm Christian Page. I'm your host, and I am joined by a name so nice that you have to say it twice. My friend Zach and my friend Zach. Zach Hightower, and Zach, as we've just discovered in the 80s, is Zach the Lego Maniac. We're here to have a great conversation about mentorship and about something that might be a little bit surprising to folks and thinking about changing systems, pulling in instead of pushing out, having a really good conversation with our friend Zach. But before we dive into any of the important stuff, and I guess this is important as well, before we dive into any of the very thought-provoking things, Zach, tell us about your journey of landing here. You're an awesome teacher at SOTA. What's been the journey that lands you in this place?
Well, I started my master's program 10 years ago for education, and my sister was working here as a history teacher, and she let me know there was a para job available. And there was a student who was coming in who needed a one-on-one, who had some really high needs and some issues at his previous school. And I thought, I'll take this job, and when an English job or a history job opens up, I'll hop on that. And then just kind of fell in love with working with students with services. Had a really close relationship with that student and his family. And then got my master's in teaching. And me and my wife had a daughter who was born with a really rare genetic disorder. And we were told, she wouldn't walk, she wouldn't talk. But we did not listen to that, and we just kept pushing and plugging. And so at that point, I decided I wanted to go full in on special education and figure out all the cool things about inclusion. And we found her an inclusive elementary school, preschool to go to. When she walked in, she didn't walk, she was on a walker and couldn't speak. And now she just started kindergarten 2 weeks ago, walking, talking in general education kindergarten, just kicking butt. And I just think that that's something that I was drawn to, is making sure that students who are marginalized get what they need so they can show that they are just as capable as anyone else.
Absolutely. I just want to pause for a second about how awesome of a story that is.
Thank you.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And both of them, right? Both the story about your daughter and also the perspective of coming to education via being a para. And I think there's so many times where people who are in those roles don't get enough respect.
Certainly.
For the amazing, the insight that they have, the skills that they have, right? This is soapbox territory very early. But thank you for sharing both of those things with us.
Yeah.
So Zach, tell us where you exist in this conversation now and how that applies to your work in mentor group.
Nice. So as one of the 2.5, because we have a 0.5 special ed teacher here as well. I just get to go around and facilitate accommodations, modifications, advocate for students' needs. I don't have my own mentor group, which is kind of a bummer, but also is awesome because I get to go around and see all the other mentor groups and and kind of glean things from their groups and share with other groups so that everybody's kind of in the circle sharing and having a good time. And so mentor group in particular is really, really important for students with services, because in the past they might have been put into just a separate setting entirely, which serves, nobody in a social capacity, right? Because our general ed students, when we get into the real world, there are people who have disabilities who work in different ways, and to not expose those two groups to each other and allow them to meet and mingle and become friends, we're doing both groups a disservice when they get out into the real world. And so having us all know each other and respect each other's differences happens and starts in mentor group. And I've seen just awesome kids having awesome times in there.
I've been in I've gotten the opportunity to teach not too far away from you. I've gotten to sit in the round room where teachers have discussions that students don't get to hear. But I've also gotten a chance to hear you speak about students at the senior breakfast, which I think is the coolest thing on the planet.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us the importance about recognizing people's strengths and speaking to those things, even in a world that sees them with a deficit.
Yeah. And I think this is true of everybody, regardless of ability or, where they're at on the cognitive spectrum, that it's important to hear when you're doing something well and when you're doing something innovative, because if you don't know, then you're just going to think, oh, nobody sees me. Nobody wants to, engage with me about this thing that I'm doing. And senior breakfast in particular is just a time when we get to highlight every single student and be like, we saw you these 4 years. We know you. What you did here was special. What you did here was valued. And so that's always the biggest thing for me, is I try and get as many of the kids with services that I can speak to. And I usually have to barter and fight with their mentor teachers, because mentor teachers love their mentees. But yeah, it's just the ability to show these kids, like, hey, I saw you. I saw what you were doing. What you were doing was innovative or really original or special or just unique to you. It's something that I haven't seen in my 10 years of teaching, and that's a big deal. And so just highlighting strength and different ways of thinking and celebrating those kids for that.
And Zach, you see what I did there?
I did, yeah.
So, Zach, and I know that this isn't something that we do often, but I just want to know from your perspective, right, as a leader in this particular space, what's the value of having someone as awesome as Zach on staff?
Oh, me, Zach?
Yeah. You see?
I want to get to that, but I also want to ask you a question, Zach, because I think when we talk about special education as an equity issue, I feel like there's a lot of subgroups in our society and in our schools that are often historically disenfranchised, right?
Yep.
And each of those groups is important to recognize as the unique challenges that each of those groups faces. I would argue that I think students with disabilities are often left out of those conversations around equity.
Certainly.
And to me, it is a moral obligation to make sure that we design a school system that supports every kid and meets them where they're at. And I think that's a really hard, challenging thing to do. And I think that's why a lot of times people just punt, because they go, oh, yeah, I can recognize that kids have socioeconomic issues that place them in a different area, skills-wise when they show up to school, or they have, certain race classifications that give them specific challenges, or they have, all these different things that place them in those. But when it comes to like meeting kids with disabilities, we've designed a system that basically says, we're going to put you in a separate category and in a separate classroom because it's just too much for most classrooms to deal with along with everything else. And I think that's a crime. I think it's unfortunate. And it's not just unfortunate for the kids that are experiencing it, but I would argue, and this is what I want to ask, it's unfortunate for the rest of our community to be robbed of the experience of not having to do class or getting to do class with kids that are different from them and seeing how that impacts the way that they look at the world. Instead of seeing it as a challenge and a disadvantage, it's actually a huge advantage. And I would argue that it's a challenge to miss out on that, to not have that experience for what we would call the general ed population. Kids don't have that experience. I remember when I was in 5th grade, there was this kid, Brian, And he had befriended a kid in a wheelchair that was in the SPED classroom. And we never saw this kid because he wasn't in our class. He would go to a different classroom in the school, but he invited him to his birthday party. And his parents were like, oh, that was really nice of you to invite the kid in a wheelchair to your birthday party. And I'm like, why is that a unique thing? Like, if the kid was in the class with us every day and we all had he probably would have gone to every birthday party.
Yeah.
But it was a special thing or unique thing that he was really like praised for inviting the kid in a wheelchair to his birthday party. It's so unfortunate to me that that's a unique experience. Like, I wish we had school systems where we brought kids in and gave them the experience of being in community with people that are different from them.
Yeah, definitely.
I didn't phrase that as a question. I'm sorry. My question is, what are the advantages that kids have from being in community, being in mentor group with students with disabilities? What are they gaining from that experience in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that just learning about like what our society has to offer as a whole, right? Like your experience, I was in a graduating high school class where I didn't have a lot of experience engaging with people with special needs or people with services. And I had to do a lot of like learning about myself and about them upon getting out into the real world, right? Because the world is a very diverse place with a lot of needs, and I just felt like I was in a little vacuum where I was, and I think it was a disservice to my ability to really engage with people who are different than I. And so I think that at our school, we're just so lucky to have a place where it's just a common meeting area. Like each class is a small like town hall forum where students can come in and really engage with one another and show their understanding through lenses that maybe typically developing students would never think of, right? I was just pushing in on a math class a couple weeks ago, one of the first weeks, and I'm not a math person, bless all you math teachers. And I was working with some of our students with services, and we were doing different sequencing of like number patterns and things like that. And I was like, oh, I got this. And I like did it my way that I just knew how to do. And then I was working with a student, and he was like, try this way. And he showed me, I'm not a numbers guy, so I'm not exactly sure what he did. But I was like, oh my gosh, does that actually work? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, let's get your teacher over here. And she came over and was like, oh, wow. And we showed it to the whole class. And everybody in the class was just like, get up and show us, explain how you just did this. And that's a place where that student in a comprehensive high school wouldn't get that opportunity. They would be off in a different area for like math teaching without the general ed population. And so both groups would miss out on key educational opportunities. Like he would not usually have gotten a chance to stand in front of all of his peers and people be in awe of what he did. And those general ed students, like me, we would have just kept doing it the way that we were doing it and not seeing there's a faster, easier, arguably better way to do it. And so having that experience, I was like, oh, this is exactly why inclusion is so important, because we're putting our students with services, we're elevating them to a spot where they can really show who they are. And that's something that a lot of these kids don't have experience in their first 14 years of life, because they have been relegated to the fringes of the education system, and like Zach said, it's a disservice to them. It's a disservice to the education system as a whole.
I think we've talked about this before, but there was a podcast I was listening to. It was talking about STEM education for students with disabilities, and they went as far as explaining how underrepresented people with disabilities are in space flight, in like NASA training, and how they're often just immediately disqualified. And this person was making the argument that there's many ways that people with specific disabilities are actually possess an advantage because of their disability in certain space situations. So they were explaining like, if you were on the space station Mir and there was a fire, and with loud noises or with smoke, someone with sight and with hearing might be battling those senses while they're trying to solve the problem, where someone that was maybe born blind is used to battling those in the dark the whole time and would actually be at an advantage in those situations to try to find a quick solution without being distracted by the loss of sight. And so they were making all these specific arguments, and they started this whole program where they were taking people with disabilities up into zero gravity experiences in these flight launches to simulate what it would be like in space, to see how their disability actually played as an advantage They had a couple of people in wheelchairs. They had a couple of deaf people, a couple people who were blind. And the information they gathered from that experience was so broad and diverse that they realized that they are creating this whole framework for where what could be perceived as a disability in many of these situations can actually be perceived as an ability. And to me, that was such a powerful thing to think about. Like, disability we see as a disadvantage, instead of reframing it as how does this actually provide an advantage for you and for a team working on a project to be able to include that person to see things differently and to have a different perspective.
Yeah, certainly. It's easy for people to see like negatives in other people's situations, but in education, and in my job in particular, with special education, you learn to see aspects of that as like there's these people's superpowers, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because there's a million different ways to do a math problem or to create a piece of art,
right?
And if we just do it the way that is blah blah blah, just 1 2 3 in steps, it's there's nothing that's going to change. There's nothing that's going to be different. And so by having students come in and utilize their superpower or their perceived disability, but really just their needs, allows them to really show that. And when they can't show that, everybody kind of loses, right?
I have a really specific question. So what does this look like for you when you're pushing into a classroom? So as opposed to being in a traditional environment where you would have a separate pull-out class, like an LRC class of 20 kids that you would spend the majority of the day with, you spend most of your day pushing into classrooms, right? Yep. And meeting. Do you ever push into mentor groups specifically?
Yeah, I push into mentor groups. Not the same mentor group. I just kind of float. That's a day for me to go around and meet some of the students on my caseload about what's happened over the week and engage in like, hey, how's your planning for your homework going? How is things going with meeting new friends? But every time I've pushed in, we obviously start with those circle questions. So everyone in the circle is answering a question that either the students have come up with or the mentors come up with, and just the interest among students, in particular when our students with services are speaking, they're like hearing about this unique experience that they have not had, and they're hearing about it through the lens of or through the eyes of someone else. And it really opens up like community within the group. It allows our students to empathize with each other in a way that they wouldn't have been able to if they weren't all in the same group. And so seeing that push in and seeing like the energy in those rooms is just amazing.
That's great. How do you specifically support mentors in doing that? Because I know we've got a whole spectrum. Some mentors that this is their first year, all the way to like some of them, there's a couple that have been here for like, almost 20 years. Yeah. So how do you push in and support mentors to help them engage with students with disabilities differently in their mentor group?
Yeah, so I generally will send out individualized emails to every member of the staff with, hey, here are the kids in your classes who have services. And it's not just the boilerplate stuff from their IEPs, like their goals, their accommodations. I also, put in their interests, what brought them to our school in the first place. Like, are they here for music? Are they here for art? Are they here because their parents want them to be in an inclusive environment? And so doing that and then pushing in with the mentor groups and kind of like facilitating those discussions is kind of what my role is, in making sure like, hey, sometimes we can see students as like a number, or like, you are a student who is in my history class and you are my mentor, and you're my mentee as well. But when we push in and we really get to know these kids on a holistic level, it becomes more than that. It's like, oh, you're not someone with disabilities first. You're a Minecraft freak first. Like, you're a board game freak first. You love anime. You love spending time with your folks. You love basketball. And so those conversations within the class is kind of how I pop in and facilitate,
That's interesting. And I think that's got to be so challenging for some, because there's some kids with disabilities where their identity gets so wrapped up in their disability because it's really apparent. Yeah. Like if I'm a kid with Down syndrome, or if I'm in a wheelchair, or I'm deaf, obviously those things are very clear to my peers when they see me. And so I would start to identify, like my identity would be wrapped up in that, versus someone who maybe their disability is not as noticeable. Maybe they have dyslexia, or maybe they have, an emotional disability or social emotional disability, or some sort of trouble regulating, time or movement. Like there's all these different ways that things get perceived, where maybe those things wouldn't lead so much to their identity, but they would prevent them from gaining access to what they're trying to accomplish.
certainly. And then it becomes, unless we really like unpack what's going on with that student and let people know, like, hey, this is who they are. They have these issues or these needs. Then teachers or people in the world might perceive them as like, oh, they're just standoffish. They're just, this or that or anything in between. But really pushing in and facilitating conversations, because a lot of these students don't yet have the skills to make those connections and those conversations happen, right? I remember being super intimidated in high school to talk to adults.
Most kids are.
Yeah, right. And
exactly.
it's at this school I've really tried to, take off that mask of like, I am an adult, and if you talk to me, we will speak about school and important blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, how's it going? What did you think of the game last night? What are you drawing right now? Tell me about this anime. I don't watch it, but I will listen to you tell me about it for a very long time. And that way I can take those conversations and go to mentors and other teachers and be like, hey, if you really want to engage this kid, let's throw in something about one of their interests.
And it's really pretty simple. Like yesterday I was having a conversation with a kid at Sammy. He just came to the front desk and he just needed to check out. But I was like, hey, how's it going? How's your day? He's like, oh, it's okay. I'm like, tell me about that shirt. He's like, oh, this is this anime character. I'm like, I don't know anything about that. Tell me about it. And he's like, oh, let me tell you. And then all of a sudden, like, he had all this information. I'm like, I don't know anything about anime, but like, I just learned a little bit. Yeah. But just asking a leading question so that their identity isn't so wrapped up in like what you can immediately see, but what they're interested in and who they are.
Yeah. And a lot of times adults won't ask them about like that. They won't ask them about their anime shirt and won't let them kind of dump all of this information about this anime onto them. But that is what they are passionate about. And by showing them that we care and that we're listening, we're showing that their passions matter. And in the past, in other schools, maybe they were kind of looked off or not listened to when they were trying to dump all this information about one of their interests, one of their niche interests. But the difference at our school is that our teachers are going to listen, they're going to engage with that, and it's going to really help how that kid engages in the classroom. Because if you feel cared about by the people in your community outside of the classroom, you're going to care more about what you do in the classroom. And that's, academics, that is empathy to your peers, that is helping just the flow of class continue and not being a disruption in any way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it seems like such a simple thing. What would that be like if you were to come up with a list of what you wish every classroom teacher knew about how to engage with students with disabilities? What would be the very top of that list? Would it be just asking them questions to get to know who they are?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. But I think that, just like in anyone else, like just, hey, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
Yeah.
Like what is your reason for being here and what do you want to achieve, right? Because a lot of times the student with the niche interest wants to pursue that and maybe doesn't see an opportunity to pursue that. And we are the adults in the room. We are the stakeholders in their future in many ways. And so by helping them and kind of pointing them in the direction of like, hey, you can do something with this. We can take this love and we can apply it to this content area. Really allows that student to flourish and show their understanding and their love for school through a lens that, is adequate for them.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah, I think we've spoken a lot about, right, like, and I always try to ask questions that are rooted in reality, right? Because for folks who may not have systems that are aware enough to have someone dedicated or FTE to that position, or if I'm speaking really frankly, right, like have not prioritized some of the things that we're talking about. There are teachers who have, or educators that have really like ought to be mentalities in a system that doesn't move very much.
Yeah.
Right. And I appreciate Zach's question about like, what should be at the top of the list of their priorities if they're responsible, in and of itself. I'm curious if we flip the shoe onto the other foot, right? Because there are individuals who ought to be educators who are also in systems who are willing to listen. Yeah. What would be at the top of your list of things that are system changes, not just personal moves, right? Because I think sometimes personal moves are used, and Zach was talking about this earlier, to like subvert broken systems or places that have not prioritized this yet. If you could, I know I'm asking you to paint with a magic wand.
Oh, that's deep into the pool here.
Yeah, exactly.
Like what system changes do you think would?
That's a great question.
In an ideal world, right? Like what would exist?
I mean, with special education, it's an individualized educational plan for each student with services. So it's sort of tailored goals to what their specific needs are, accommodations to ensure equity. And I think that that's something that should be system-wide, regardless of perceived ability or lack of ability or whatever you'd like to call it, that every student should have, an individualized education plan that best suits their needs. I'm someone who never really struggled in school, but didn't really put my best foot forward. I could get by just doing the minimum. But if I was given an opportunity to maybe show my interests and my loves through my schoolwork a little bit more and have like a plan being like, this is kind of what Zach needs to do Zach really effectively. In writing, that would have been really helpful, right? So I think making sure that, equity is ensured through every student who walks into this building or walks into a school in this country having an individualized educational plan.
And is that something that, now I'm asking the nitty gritty of an imaginary conversation, but is that something that is done for the student, with the student, both? Is that co-created? Like, where do students get to speak into that process? Yeah,
so it's really interesting doing this job at the high school level, because I'm coming in when ninth graders come in and we have their first meeting and their first IEP, the parents are kind of like, wait a minute, they get to come and speak, and I'm like, yeah, I want them to be running this meeting by the time that they're a junior. So I really want these students to be able to kick down doors and say, this is what I need to succeed. This is what I am entitled to as a student and as a person. And so it's super interesting that potentially prior to entering high school, they have maybe a little less, like the student themselves probably has a little less say about like, here's what your goals are, here's what accommodations you are. It's more teacher and parent. Whereas at SOTA, Sammy, and IDEA, it's the whole team. Like, so the student is running that show. If the student can't make the meeting, we're not going to have the meeting until they are there. And I've had parents be like, oh, they can't make it. And I'm like, hey, I'll reschedule it whenever you want to reschedule it, whatever your schedule is. But I need that kid at this meeting so that they see what this is for and they can see like what they can get out of this, right?
Mm-hmm. So hearing two things, right? If I'm the out-to-be educator, we're building relationship with students and understanding their interests, being able to be open and ask those questions, and then finding ways to get interest matter into subject matter, if at all possible. 100%. Also hearing on the other side, if we're talking about the ideal system, right? Like, these are individualized education plans and not just specific for students with services, but for everyone, right? Like, it only makes sense to educate people not as batches, but as individuals, especially in the individualized world that we're walking into.
For sure.
Spicy question. In education, how close or how far are we from actualizing either one of those things?
Oof. I think that in the element schools with our staffs, I think I always assume best intent with our teachers, and so I see them engaging with students in the hallway about things that, like, I mean, I have no interest in some of these things, but and I know that they don't because I know that teacher, but they are out there listening, asking questions. So I think that is something that's really attainable, especially at our schools, because there's a reason that teachers come to teach here. I've never taught anywhere else, and I don't really have any interest in teaching anywhere else, just because of the relationships that our staff has with the students. And that's something that when I came in as a para, I was like, oh, dang, like this is where I want to be. As far as every student getting an individualized educational plan, I think as a society, we're probably pretty far away from that. We're still arguing about understanding what equity is for a lot of people. And so they think that if one student has one thing that another doesn't have, that's not fair, but that's not the case, right? Because we all need different things in order to succeed. Like I said, as a student, I got by just fine. I didn't really need anything else, but that was it. Whereas like my little brother struggled in school and needed a little bit more assistance, but when he got it, he was a real butt kicker. And I didn't feel like he was getting something I wasn't getting. I felt like he was being given something he needed, and I just didn't need it. I always tell kids when it comes to equity, it's Mario Kart, right? Like first place, you're not getting those big items because you don't need them. You're good at Mario Kart. You're fine. You kicking my butt. But if I'm in 8th place, man, I need a star. I need something to get me up there because I'm not good at this game.
Does it really work that way? I never noticed that about Mario Kart.
It's the most equitable game there is.
That's so funny.
That's how I taught kids in my English classes when I was an English teacher prior to SPED about equity, and they were like, "Oh, that's what equity is," and I was like, "Yeah."
That's why whenever I'm like winning a race with my kids in Mario Kart, I always get the bomb, and I'm like, I don't want a bomb. I just gotta throw it away every time. I don't need this.
You get the best stuff when you're in last.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
That's why my kids always beat me.
That's like the title of a TED Talk. Mario Kart taught me everything I need to know about equity, or something like that.
There we go.
I'm ready for it whenever they call
let's
you.
go. It'll be a SPED talk.
No, I think that's a fantastic analogy, and I appreciate even the comparison, like, and not even comparison, but telling the story between you and your brother, right? Of someone being close to you, because I think that's also a great way to think, because you're in the same household, in the same school, in the same place, in the same, right? And have two vastly different sets of needs.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes we get caught up on this idea of universal perspective or like fairness, for example, that serves as a barrier, right, for us actually achieving some of the ideals around equity.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, and this is getting real philosophical here, so I'm sorry.
Let's go.
But this, I mean, we've come, as a society, as a species, right? I think for a long time we awarded people based off of bloodline and lineage, and then we kind of moved to this democratic idea of, okay, we're going to reward people based off of merit. So if you've worked really hard, if you've earned something, then you get these rewards. I think the next step in that evolution as a species is to reward people based off of need. Instead of saying you've worked hard and earned this, therefore you get this, and that's what's fair. What's fair is to say it's not about how hard you work, it's about how the resources that you need in order to be successful. And I think there's still a lot of fear around that idea. People think that that's communism or that's socialism or that's that it just removes the drive for people to be successful. I don't believe that. I think in schools, we understand that we have learners of all different abilities, and the people in our society that need the most support and the most time and resources are the ones that should be rewarded with that in order to be successful, instead of saying, if you haven't achieved, you don't get anything. If you're at the top, you get extra rewards that move you forward. We need to move beyond merit and move towards need. And I think that's a hard shift for people.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's like a school, a system, a society should be measured by how the most vulnerable among us is treated and what opportunities they are given. And when those opportunities aren't given, I don't exactly need to say what I think of that society or school or system, because it sucks. So we have this luxury to work at this place where we really do take care of the most vulnerable among us in our population, and that's through educational access, opportunity, peer inclusion, just in general. Like it's why I hear stories of my teacher friends from other schools, and they're like, you get to do what? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, that sounds really awesome. Can I have an application? And I was like, you are, yeah.
Join the queue.
Join the queue.
I agree with what you presented, Zach, and I can hear the people coming to get you already.
I know, right? Well, I mean, to be fair, I will say, like, as a classroom teacher, I'm just going to be honest, it is hard. It is very difficult to do that.
Yeah. It
requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of reframing and a lot of seeing the bigger picture. Because in the moment, you're task oriented. You want to get through the lesson. Here's the goals and objectives, and I've got 80% of the kids there, and then I've got these 3 kids that it's just so much work to get them there. And why do I have to spend so much time on these kids? And it requires a lot of reframing to go, because that is the work. It's about all those kids. And if those 3 at the top you don't even need to talk to because they're going to figure it out on their own, and the 3 here need some extra time and support, that's why you're there. That's what the work is. And it is hard. I do want to have empathy I was a teacher for 10 years, and I do know that it's very hard. It means you spend a lot of time with a handful of kids, walking them through it, and then with support with people like Zach. So it is very hard, but that is the work.
Yeah, it's our job.
Right, exactly. Dun, 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 dun.
Song must be written.
Right.
must be performed next time that we have you on the podcast. It's our job. I can hear the Sopranos in the back already. But Zach, thank you for the work thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I appreciate you joining us on the philosophical drift too.
Oh, always.
Right. I think that there's a lot that asks us in terms of tactics and strategies. But some of this is hard work. Some of this is gut work. Some of it is soul work. And I appreciate you being willing to jump on that journey with us. So until next time, we appreciate you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for coming to hang out with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Elements of Education is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in Tacoma, Washington, dedicated to changing public education to better serve the specific and diverse needs of students in our public schools. For more information about how you can support the work that we do, please visit elementsofed.org, or you can find us on Instagram at Elements of Education or on our website.